So for an entire year, I have wondered why we celebrate this Dickens work every December, but not this one. Then I read it. Now I know. Salutations, fellow readers, writers, and killers of time on YouTube, and I'm here today at Dickens Fest in Eminence, Kentucky, to more scenically use the androgynous sound of my voice to share with you a few words about A Cricket on the Hearth, a novella published in 1845 and a commercial success in Dickens' lifetime, though not as universally acclaimed as A Christmas Carol, published 2 years earlier. For what it's worth, George Orwell liked it, as befits the socially conscious idiom he shared with Dickens. Vladimir Lenin hated, capital H, hated it, esteeming it dull and saccharine, though when Lenin walked out of the theatrical production at which he was exposed to Cricket on the Hearth, the pride of Russia might have been at stake. See, toward the middle of the story, a man named John thinks his wife Dot is cheating on him and takes a gun off the wall, with intent to kill his rival. The cricket starts chirping furiously as if to say, "No, don't! Chekhov was wrong, it doesn't have to be this way!" And John's all, "Shut up, I'm gonna kill him." So the cricket ups his game and summons fairies, yes, fairies, who are all like, "No, really, it's a Dickens story, just give the plot contrivance a couple more pages to kick in." And John's all, "Fine. Maybe next time, Mr. Chekhov." The cricket's role in the lives of his humans, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, is kind of as an emotional and spiritual barometer of his household. If his people are happy, the cricket chirps. If his people are sad, the cricket is quiet? In all honesty, I'm not actually sure because I fell asleep while trying to read the first chapter. Twice. So, in order to get some focus back and maybe rekindle an interest in the project, because should there be any unexplored cool stuff in the book, I legitimately wanted to share it with you, I took a break from the book and looked to the movies for what adapters of Cricket on the Hearth might have thought was worth highlighting. The two most readily available versions on YouTube are the 1909 silent film, which features no cricket but gets the gist of the complex Dickensian relationships across fairly well, and the Rankin Bass film of 1967, which, you know what? Let's dawdle a little before we try to look at that monstrosity in the eye. Although, between live action and animation would be a good instinct, in that it has the potential to give the titular cricket nuance of expression and make him a real character instead of a weird, semi-sentient good luck charm. There's even evidence that this could work really well, as seen in Disney's Pinocchio, including friendly nods to Dickens in the character of Jiminy Cricket, from his inexplicable tightness with fairies, to his behavior as the conscience to his humanoids, to this line,
"Of course I'm just a cricket singing away from hearth to hearth."
But the Disney studio did an incredible job bringing their cricket to life back in 1940, which I think in part is why it is so startling almost 30 years later that in 1967, the same year Disney released The Jungle Book, mind you, Rankin and Bass gave their viewers this. And I get it. Rankin and Bass leaned toward television budgets, not cinematic releases, and you can't just copy a well-known Disney character. But guys, the old cricket has wrinkles. Why would the old exoskeleton-endowed cricket have wrinkles? Though, to the credit of the 1967 film, I did not fall asleep while watching it. I was too busy more or less doing this. But in order to understand some of how this movie goes wrong, let's take a look at the book and see what the old guard Cricket on the Hearth got wrong and what it got right. The main players of the Dickens classic are John, Dot, May, Edward, Bertha, Caleb, and Mr. Tackleton. As the story begins, May is engaged to Edward, but gets engaged to Mr. Tackleton when she hears that Edward died at sea. Edward's sister Bertha, who happens to be blind, and their father Caleb go to work making toys for Mr. Tackleton at below poverty wage. Meanwhile, Caleb has been lying to Bertha for years, trying to shield her from how horrible their life and their boss truly is, because she's blind, I guess, and knowing how bad things really are would just make Bertha needlessly sad. A course of action that backfires when Caleb does such a good job of downplaying Mr. Tackleton's awfulness that Bertha thinks she loves him. Mr. Tackleton, the Scrooge/Mr. Potter character of this particular Christmas story, straight up calls kind-hearted Bertha a poor idiot for thinking he is anything other than a bastard. Then, toward the middle of the book, a stranger in disguise gets friendly with Dot, and Mr. Tackleton, being not only a rich bastard but a shit-starter as well, tells John his wife Dot is cheating on him with the stranger. And aside from the part where John loses an argument with some fairies, and the scene goes on for way too long because Dickens wrote as one who is getting paid by the word, what follows is really thoughtful and cool, because John ends up having an honest chat with himself about what he might have done to make his wife unhappy enough to cheat, and what he can do going forward to better care for his wife's needs. And all kidding aside, it is awesome. you don't tend to see that in fiction every day, let alone pulpy, ridiculous fiction from the 1840s. I said later, Mr. Dickens. I may take back as many as 2 of the nasty things I said about you. Also, while we are in the neighborhood of saying nice things about this and other Dickens works, I have gone on record as saying that Tiny Tim was far from my favorite character ever, and at first glance I wasn't especially fond of Bertha Plummer for similar reasons. Well-meaning writers use disabled folks in their narratives less as contributing characters, and more as props or earthbound angels who are too good for this world. But at the time these stories were written, it was largely presumed that if a fictional character had physical flaws, they were, without exception, the villain. Deformity on the outside supposedly signaled a deformity of character. So the fact that Dickens was writing differently abled characters, who were unimpeachably kind and lovely, was a big deal in 1847, and likely paved the way for more positive representation in fiction down the road. Anyway, it turns out the stranger Dot's been hanging out with is Edward, back from the Navy in disguise and also not dead. Dot overhears John planning to set her free so she and their baby can be happy without him, and she tearfully reassures John she loves him beyond reason. Edward reveals himself to May, and they marry at once. Bertha is shown to be kind of unobservant, but when Caleb finally comes clean about lying to her for years, it turns out she is way less fragile than Caleb thought, and she forgives him because she's just that sweet. Mr. Tackleton sulks a little after getting jilted, but eventually gives the happy couple the cake that was meant for him and May, since he has no use for a wedding cake now, and dances at their reception, whereafter the cricket puts up his feet and rests comfortably on his hearth after a job well done. The 1909 film gets most of this across fairly effortlessly, and in only 12.5 minutes. So how did Rankin Bass use their 50 minutes on the television of you or your ancestors to tell their version of the same story? Well,
the shock of that awful message, delivered the way it was, turned poor Bertha blind.
Wow. Or, to speak in the vernacular of the ancients, Jiminy Crickets. Now, I know what Rankin and Bass were going for. They wanted the marketability of Dickens, without having to animate mischief between 10 characters of Dickensian complexity. And the result is that some characters got combined for ease of storytelling and budget. But not only is blinding Bertha with grief a very strange call compared to introducing her as blind from birth the way Dickens did, the Bertha and Edward we meet in the book are brother and sister. That wouldn't have to be a huge problem, since movies change up names and condense characters all the time, if the movie didn't then include shots like this. Why would a dad keep a picture frame around with him, his little girl, and this little boy if the little boy was not his son? The visual implication, however unintentional, is that Bertha fell in love with and intended to marry her brother, which is only the first of several baffling visuals in this scene, as the portrait changes to joyless children on a carousel, which then fades to joyless children on a teeter-totter made of shoes, which then fades to those same children bobbing up and down on pieces of pie. And somewhere off-screen, an unheard strawberry alarm clock goes off, as evidenced by the scenery melting into a 70s-style psychedelic puddle. And I wish that was the freakiest implication in this movie, but it doesn't stop there. Shortly after Bertha goes blind, Caleb, her dad, sings one of several no-good, very bad songs in which he promises she can still see the world through his eyes, and that he'll make a point of always seeing beautiful things. Then the animator zooms into one of Caleb's eyes, in which he sees his little girl in a fancy gown, then dancing, then reaching for her dead fiancé, at which time the picture of her and her fiancé fades into a picture of her and her dad. The implication in film language, however unintentional, is that this girl's dad sees her less as Bertha and more as Lolita. Later on, the cricket gets sent on his own little adventure, presumably for reasons of padding the runtime, and we see this. Which, in fairness, contains one of the movie's catchier songs, and possibly led to this superior but eerily similar scene in The Great Mouse Detective almost 20 years later. Which, I mean, hats off to the guy who stole this, because whoever caught him would have to admit that they watched Cricket on the Hearth, and no one wants to trade the bragging rights of catching the thief with the shame of admitting they've seen Cricket on the Hearth. After that, the cricket gets captured and taken to a sea captain known to sell good luck crickets on the black market in China, and this happens. Because what even is a children's Christmas special without implied gun violence? There's more stupid, ridiculous fun to be had in this movie, and I would actually encourage anyone who's chasing that madness-inducing high they got the first time they watched Santa Claus Meets the Ice Cream Bunny for the first time to watch Rankin and Bass's Cricket on the Hearth. But in short, the book is not great, the cartoon is prize-takingly inept, and if you, as an adapter of this story, find yourself cutting everything that made the original story cool, while adding fat-bottom saloon cats and children without souls riding ghost pie, maybe consider adapting a different story. As always, thank you for giving these videos a shot. Merry Christmas if you like that sort of thing, and if you don't, it's okay. There is nothing wrong with you if this time of year makes you more sad than happy, and the people who matter will love you anyway, and so will I.